Okay, guys, hello. I'm back again. It's been quite a while. I've been on hiatus, kind of. Yeah, and I recently got myself an iPad, and I kind of just felt like, fuck it, I'll try making videos on this. And unfortunately, I can't find a way to be able to show my face and record the screen at the same time. But to be honest, you probably don't want to see my ugly mug anyway, so it's probably not a big issue. So anyway, this video today is a response to a debate between I Hypocrite and a fella called Jangles, and it was a debate about the prevalence of how do I put it? Basically, sexual predators in the trans movement, or trans people in particular. And I'm not actually touching on that point specifically. I'd rather leave that for another I was going to say episode, another video. But I think what I would like to do is there was a broader discussion about mental health and narcissism in trans people, and that is something that I really want to talk about. It's been something I've been thinking about for quite a long time, and I've had this theory that when it comes to trans people, there are multiple and varied reasons as to why people become trans or non-binary or something like that, okay? And there seems to be a tendency on the left, or with SJWs, or with woke people, or whatever you want to call them, to accept all trans people at face value and accommodate all of them and all of their unreasonable demands, without any second thought as to any other motive behind what they're doing. And I think that is an incredibly naive position to take. Now, I will preface this and say that I do believe that that there are definitely legitimate trans people. I mean, Blair White, in my opinion, is a good example of this. She's confident in herself. She tries very hard to become a woman. In her mind, she is a woman. She's trying to be a woman, and I can respect that far much more. I know it does come from a fundamental, I guess you can call it a delusion or whatever if you want. I'm not trying to diss her or anything. However, I find her to be a more legitimate trans person who is not, her identity is solid. Like, she's not going to be completely destroyed by the thought of somebody calling her a man, right? She knows she was a man, and she makes no bones about the fact that she used to be a man. She just knows that she's a woman now, and she is happy and comfortable in that situation. I'm sure she has her ups and downs with it, but generally speaking, I get the vibe that she's very comfortable in that identity, and it would take a lot for somebody to harm that identity, even if they outright try to, dead name them or, try and misgender them, whatever. And there's a few other trans people out there that I really enjoy, like Rose of Dawn, who have a similar kind of thing. And you even see certain trans people on the left kind of trying to put that point out there a little bit, but getting shot down for it. And I was going to bring up contrapoints in that respect. But anyway, we're kind of getting off topic. So basically, I wanted to bring forward at least the hypothesis, the theory, for people to think about, that there are multifaceted reasons as to why people become trans. It is not just because of dysphoria, and there are certain chicken and egg questions that need to be asked when it comes to the trans question. And that question being, are people trans because of a mental illness. Like, is mental illness driving the transness, or are they mentally ill because they are trans? Right? There's like a kind of chicken and egg situation going on. Like, did the chicken come before the egg, or the egg before the chicken? You know, it's one of those fundamental questions where, you know, are people being driven to want to become trans for more reasons just than dysphoria, or is dysphoria incurred, or does it happen because of a different, is it like a subsect of a different personality disorder or mental health issue? So I kind of wanted to go through some things here. So we've got our first page. So as you can see from the title, it's a systematic review of mental disorder, suicide, and deliberate self-harm in lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. Now, I tailored this to start off with the general mental health of the LGB groups, mainly because most trans people are coming from this group. So they either started off as gay, or they started off as queer, whatever, bisexual, whatever. They kind of, a lot of trans people come from these groups. So I wanted to kind of just establish that before we even get into trans people, there's already a well-documented issue with mental health and personality disorders in the homosexual community. And that is not, by the way, that's not. I'm not trying to say that homosexual people in any way are bad or anything like that. All I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to show that there is an increased chance of XYZ different things that can create different outcomes, and we need to be wary of it, and it needs to be included in the conversation. We can't just gloss over these things, especially if we do care about homosexual people and homosexual groups. If we care about them, we care about their mental health and how we're going to deal with all this, we need to acknowledge that it's there, and not make any bones about it, and also recognise that there are positive and negative consequences to these situations. Okay, there's positives to acknowledge it in it because we can help people. There's negatives to it because obviously people with mental health problems can often cause a lot of problems in other people's lives. So we have to acknowledge the duality of this situation, and, you know, just have a healthy discussion about it. I also want to make it clear that this is not the majority of gay or homosexual peoples. It is not on that level. We're not trying to say that majority of people are like this. All we're saying is there are higher frequencies of it. Therefore, there are when the straight people get a little wary about, say, transgender bathrooms or all these different policies that are trying to be enacted because of trans identities and all this stuff, that they may or have a point as to why this might be an issue, and it's because people with personality disorders or mental health issues may exploit these things and become abusive. So, you know, we need to recognize this as a real issue and problem. Okay, that is the point of this video. I'm not trying to attack anybody. I'm just trying to get to the truth. Okay, so let's get into it. So this one is a systematic review of meta-analysis of the prevalence of mental disorder, substance misuse, suicide, suicidal ideation, and deliberate self-harm in LGBT people. So they studied a whole bunch of different studies over many years, many different people. There was 13,000 papers were identified, but only 476 were selected, and 28 actually met the criteria that they actually held as an exclusive to meet their metrics that they felt was fair. So, basically, the meta-analysis revealed that there was a twofold excess in suicide attempts in lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, the risk of depression and anxiety disorders on meta-analysis were at least 1.5 times higher. Alcohol and substance misuse was also 1.5 times higher. Results were similar in both sexes, but meta-analysis revealed that lesbian and bisexual women were particularly at risk of substance dependence. while lifetime prevalence of suicide attempts was especially high in gay and bisexual men. So, in conclusion, obviously, LGBT people are at higher risk of mental disorders. So that's that. This is also backed up by the Centre for Suicide Prevention, Transgender People and Suicide. So transgender people face unique stressors. So obviously, we can also say that obviously part of the reason why homosexual groups may have higher rates of personality disorders and mental illness is because they do face certain discriminations, and those discriminations were a lot harsher, say 20, 30 years ago. The prevalence of those kind of stresses or trauma are probably lessened a lot over time, but I wouldn't say that they're not there. I know that definitely kids can be cruel, and especially in school, if you're gay or whatever, that you may get bullied. The only thing I would say that is probably changed today is that if you do get bullied for being gay, you probably have a lot more people that have your back for that, whereas, say, 20, 30 years ago, you probably didn't. So, things do change, and hopefully that will get more positive. So maybe we will see the amount of mental health issues and the amount of personality disorders and things like that decrease over time. But obviously at the moment, what we've got is a bit of a mishmash of things going on. So, all right, so so as we go through, so they're kind of making definitions here. So are trans people more at risk of suicide? Trans people are more at risk of suicide than heterosexual people and lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, even though we already know that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people already have higher rates than heterosexual people. So trans people have even higher rates than lesbian, gay, and bisexual. So this singles out trans people in a particular way. So it does show that there are elevated rates here of mental issues, okay? So trans people also experience mental illness at significant higher rates than general population. This heightened risk is primarily due to the fact that transgender people face unique stressors. I did just acknowledge that, I would say that trans people probably do face certain discriminations. However, I would also say that a lot of trans people don't become trans until they are in their late teens or older. It's becoming a bit more of a trend to become an early teens thing now, but it's generally during pubescence and upwards. And I just want to stress that, because it's not like how do I put this? I don't know how to really fully formulate this thought, but it comes about later on in life. I don't know, I just get the feeling that, when it comes to gay people, it formulates much earlier. I knew people who turned out to be gay when I was a child. I'd known them since 4 or 5 years old, and we all knew they were gay then. I didn't know any trans people. I only met trans people when I was a teenager, and it just makes me wonder about the nature of transgenderism, because obviously there is a discussion at the minute that trans people are born the way they are, and I would expect maybe there are some who are born like that. I'm not an expert on the subject, but I just want to throw it out there. I do think it is a little strange that the vast majority of people who do become trans or non-binary or whatever it is tend to come out in the teenage years or older. I mean, there's a lot of people who come out even older than that, in their 20s or 30s, 50s. So, I do think, especially the ones who come out when they're older, I definitely worry about those people. I think the likelihood of them being incredibly narcissistic is probably quite high. But anyway, let's get down. So, I also wonder sometimes about, because of the rates of the mental illnesses and the personality disorders in particular, I do wonder how much of the stressors and the reasons why trans people end up in the positions that they are is to do with their own behaviour. I'm not trying to victim blame here. I'm sure a lot of it is out of their control, and I'm sure there's a lot of bullying, there's a lot of parents who disown their kids, and just discrimination in general. I'm sure there is. I'm really sure there is. But however, there is another side to the coin, and that is that there are trans people out there who are extremely antagonistic, extremely self-important, extremely, like I say, just narcissistic in general. And that kind of behaviour, whether you're trans or not, it does lead to people hating you. It just does. Like, if you're a white straight guy who's narcissistic, people will probably hate you. If you're a black woman who is narcissistic, people will probably hate you. It doesn't matter who you are. If you are narcissistic, people will probably hate you, and it's to do with the behaviours that come along with that kind of personality disorder. Same with borderline as well, and that's all I mean by that. I'm not saying that trans people are intrinsically disliked just because they're trans. I'm saying that perhaps that trans people have higher rates of narcissistic personality disorders and things of that nature, and that leads people to dislike them, not the other way around. Not that people don't just dislike them because they're trans, if that makes sense. So we've also got Stonewall here that also talk about similar statistics. So if we go down to health, we've got almost half of trans people in Britain have attempted suicide at least once. I've actually known a couple of trans people myself who have committed suicide, and it was, extremely sad. And I had a couple of discussions with one in particular who committed suicide before they committed suicide. And I wasn't trying to convince them they weren't trans or anything. We all accepted them as trans. And, we did have a couple of discussions about the nature of transvesticism and stuff like that. And I didn't have the same opinions that I do now. However, I did question a couple of things, and they got very, very upset by this. And I'd never accused them of anything. I was never disrespectful to them in any way, shape or form. And by the way, the suicide was nothing to do with me. It was to do with their own life. To be honest with you, I barely interacted with them. I just worked with them. I did really like them, though. And, I thought it was really, really sad when they passed. But, it's the point of that, what I'm getting at, is that I feel that part of the reason they did commit suicide was to do with their transness, and I think it did make them very ill. Any question against their identity, or even just the discussion of transgenderism in general, seemed to really, really upset them and really distort their mental health. And that to me is not healthy. It's really not healthy. And to even have discussions about the subject to make you go completely off the rails mentally. I'm not saying that's what I did to them, but I think that the whole nature of it, like not being realistic about the nature of transgenderism and obfuscating the truth, it creates a lot of cognitive dissonance for people who are already experiencing severe levels of cognitive dissonance. It must warp reality in a way that is very difficult to come to terms with, and that is probably why the suicide rates are so high with trans people, because it doesn't matter. It seems to not matter if they transition with operations or not, or hormones or not. There seems to be some surface level effects where it does help the dysphoria, but other psychological problems that they have seem to persist. And that is a huge problem for people. And like you say, more than half of 50% of trans people reported that they have been told by their GP they don't know enough about trans-related care to provide it. And this speaks to, this is something that we do need to talk about, because, I've got a few studies here, but there are by no means a lot of studies that cover this. And it is very difficult. I mean, even professional GPs are having trouble with this issue because there's just not enough evidence and not enough studies out there to deal with the issue. So I'm trying with this video to compile what there is out there, like some of the most definitive studies. There are a lot of bits and pieces and articles and stuff like that, but I've tried to get the most definitive stuff that I could get, which honestly isn't a lot. And, you know, but it's just to have a different framework in the discussion, because I find a lot of left-wing people, like this guy Jangles and whoever else out there, they have these very deterministic and absolute ways of thinking about trans issues and gender issues in general, and they do not consult any of this kind of literature. They do not want to bear out the opposite side of the opinion, because I think both are correct in a certain respect. However, we need diversity in the discussion if we're going to get anywhere. If we're going to help trans people, we need to look at the good and the bad so that we can get to the reality. If we just gloss over it, it doesn't help anyone. In fact, that exacerbates the problem, you know? So anyway, let's get on with it. So sorry, I'm going to rant a lot. That's the nature of my videos. If you've seen my videos before, you know this is what I'm like. But I'm trying to speed through it and try and keep it quick. So, long-term follow-up of transsexual persons undergoing sex reassignment surgery. So, now we're getting to evidence that kind of shows that even with sex reassignment surgeries, this study was conducted over a period of, you know, from 1973 to 2003. And so I'll put all the links to these in the description as well if you want to look at them yourself, because I haven't fully studied every last little bit of these things here. You know, I'm not sitting here claiming to be an expert, but it does seem to suggest, though, that like I said, it says in the conclusions, although it alleviates gender dysphoria having the operation, it may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism and should inspire improved psychiatric and somatic care after sex reassignment for this patient group, because it does suggest that suicidal behaviour, psychiatric morbidity persists even after the operations. So, you know, it does lead me to suggest that perhaps the transsexualism may not have been occurring or the gender dysphoria may not have been occurring in a vacuum. It may be occurring because of other psychological issues that are pushing gender dysphoria, that are causing a gender dysphoria. And that's what these findings would suggest to me. Or perhaps gender dysphoria is being prescribed in a way that is not helpful. Like maybe it isn't gender dysphoria, maybe it's not that is happening to them right now. They claim that it is, but perhaps, you know, it's attention seeking or whatever the hell it is, you know, and they just convince themselves. And that is part of narcissistic personalities. So we're going to now I ordered this in a really stupid way. Sorry, I've ordered this in a way that should go from one to the next. So, sorry about that. One was out of order. So, I want to frame up what borderline personality or disorder is first. And there's a reason for this, and we'll get to that in a second when we move on to the next studies. But I just think that we need to have a quick overview of what borderline personality disorder is and what narcissistic personality disorder is, and how they relate to the homosexual experience in general. Okay? So, borderline personality disorder is a mental health disorder that impacts the way you think and feel about yourself and others, causing problems functioning in everyday life. It includes self-image issues, difficulty managing emotions and behaviour, and a pattern of unstable relationships. With borderline personality disorder, you have an intense fear of abandonment or instability. You may have difficulty tolerating being alone, yet inappropriate anger, impulsiveness, and frequent mood swings may push others away, even though you want to have loving and lasting relationships. Borderline personality disorder usually begins by early adulthood. The condition seems to be worse in young adulthood and may gradually get better with age. If you have borderline personality disorder, don't get discouraged. Many people with this disorder get better over time with treatment and can learn to live satisfying lives. So this is something important that does separate BPD from NPD, and that is that borderline is very much more treatable, and that's just something to keep in mind, because it does give a lot of hope, I think, for certain people. But if we look at some of the symptoms of this, you might start to recognise certain reactions in the trans movement when certain things happen. Okay, and we'll have a similar thing with NPD when we get to NPD. Okay. So the signs and symptoms may include an intense fear of abandonment, even go to extreme measures to avoid real or imagined separation or rejection, a pattern of unstable, intense relationships, such as idealising someone one moment and then suddenly believing the person doesn't care enough or is cruel, rapid changes in self-identity and self-image that include shifting goals and values and seeing yourself as bad or as if you don't exist at all. Periods of stress-related paranoia and loss of contact with reality, lasting from a few minutes to a few hours. Impulsive and risky behaviour, such as gambling, reckless driving, unsafe sex, spending sprees, binge eating and drug abuse, or sabotaging success by suddenly quitting a good job or ending a positive relationship. Suicidal threats or behaviour or self-injury, often in response to fear. So this ties in to the suicidal behaviour. Wide mood swings lasting from a few hours to a few days, which can include intense happiness, irritability, shame or anxiety, ongoing feelings of emptiness, inappropriate intense anger, such as frequently losing your temper, being sarcastic or bitter, or having physical fights. So this can come about from different factors. Obviously you can have a stressful childhood, and that's probably one of the main ones, is just unstable family relationships and things like that. And that can come from any economic background, say you just have a dad who's not around that much or whatever, works a lot, something like that. It can happen from any, from upper class to lower class. Doesn't really matter. It can happen everywhere. Okay? So how does that relate then to homosexuality? So the frequency of personality disorders in patients with gender identity disorder. So first of all, actually, we want to go back to homosexuality. So we actually want to save that one for now. So we'll go with sexual orientation and relationship choice in borderline personality disorder over 10 years of prospective follow-up. So this is quite a long-form study. So we're just going to read the first couple of pages. So the purpose of this study was to assess the prevalence of homosexuality, bisexuality, and same-sex relationships in a sample of 362 hospitalised subjects, 290 with borderline personality disorder, and 72 comparison subjects with other personality disorders. At baseline and at 5 contiguous 2-year follow-up intervals, subjects meeting the DIBR and DSM-3R criteria for BPD, blah, blah, blah. Subjects with BPD were significantly more likely than comparison subjects to report homosexual or bisexual orientation and intimate same-sex relationships. There were no significant differences between male and female borderline subjects in prevalence of reported homosexual or bisexual orientation, or in prevalence of reported same-sex relationships. Subjects with BPD were significantly more likely than comparison subjects to report changing the gender of intimate partners, but not sexual orientation, at some point during the follow-up period. A reported family history of homosexual or bisexual orientation was a significant predicator of an aggregate outcome variable assessing homosexual bisexual orientation in the borderline subjects. Results of this study suggest that same gender attraction and or intimate relationship choice may be an important interpersonal issue for approximately 1/3 of both men and women with BPD. So obviously this shows that with BPD doesn't necessarily cause homosexuality. However, those with homosexuality are more likely to have BPD. Okay, so that is something to put out there, and that obviously does affect people. And there's a bunch of results here about this that come from different studies. If you read in the introduction, I'm not going to read all of them there, but I'll put the link in the description because it is quite interesting. They do vary wildly. Like, you've got one here that says 58% versus 16% in terms of how many people have BPD that they diagnosed that were gay, and others have a more conservative figure of about 16.7. So there are slightly different and varying results, and I expect that's to do with the nature of the people, the nature of the studies and all that business, but all of them do point towards a higher proportion, a higher chunk of people having those kinds of disorders. So now we get on to the next one, the frequency of personality disorders in patients with gender identity disorder. So, comorbid psychiatric disorders affect prognosis, blah, 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 blah. In this paper, we assess the frequency of personality disorders in Iranian GID. So this is something that I Hypocrite actually used, was this study. Now, I will say they threw this study out in the debate, and I actually found the study and I read it, and I read, how they did it and why they did it, and it's quite an interesting study. Now, I will say that the idea that perhaps the rate that perhaps this study is disingenuous is a possibility, especially given the Iranian stance on homosexuality, and that they do force people, if they do feel that they are trans, to transition. Like, they can't marry or engage in life essentially unless they are on a road to transition. So it's I would expect that would cause a lot more problem. I reckon that after we've looked at some of the earlier studies that suggest that trauma does create more personality disorders, perhaps with the kind of culture that Iran has towards homosexuality and all the rest, perhaps there are higher rates. So maybe when they say that the frequency of personality disorders was 81.4%, perhaps that comes about, maybe the really high number for that is because of the really high problems with discrimination against homosexual people. But it does raise a question as to the nature or link between the homosexuality, transness, and personality disorders. It does raise questions about the triangulation of those three things. Now, I'm not saying I have an answer for any of that or a good explanation as to why they all kind of coexist, but they seem to in the literature, regardless of whether it's Iran, all through the UK to Denmark to America. So we've got a good basis to show that personality disorders do show up a lot with trans people and homosexuality and homosexual groups in general. So now we're going to talk about narcissistic personality disorder. Now, the narcissistic personality is something that I've studied a lot, and I'm probably going to talk about it a few times on my channel going forward, because I honestly think there are some very interesting things about narcissistic personality disorder that are beginning to shape our society in a lot of ways. And there are some very, very good people out there on YouTube who talk about narcissism. There are also some people out there who talk about narcissism on YouTube that I would say be wary of, because I do think there is a tendency for narcissistic people to be engaged in the discussion of narcissism, and that muddies the waters about narcissism and the nature of it and the behaviours of it. So just keep that in mind when you are looking into narcissism as a subject on YouTube. But anyway, let's get into the quick overview of narcissistic personality disorder. So it's one of several types of personality disorders. It's a mental condition which people have an inflated sense of their own importance. Now, that's something to take into consideration. A deep need for excessive attention and admiration, troubled relationships, and a lack of empathy for others. But behind this mask of extreme confidence lies a fragile self-esteem that's vulnerable to the slightest criticism, even if they're not even being directly criticised. Remember that. A narcissistic personality disorder causes problems in many areas of life, such as relationships, work, school, or financial affairs. People with narcissistic personality disorder may be generally unhappy and disappointed when they're not given the special favours or admiration they believe they deserve. They may find their relationships unfulfilling, and others may not enjoy being around them. Treatment for narcissistic personality disorder centres around talk therapy. Although it's not, just so you know, it's not usually very effective with narcissistic people. So what are some of the symptoms? They have an exaggerated sense of self-importance. They have a sense of entitlement and require constant, excessive admiration. They expect to be recognised as superior, even without achievements that warrant it. So this speaks to part of the trans movement where they're just like, I don't even have to present as trans. I'm just trans. You know, watch out for people like that, because we're matching things up here. Exaggerate their achievements and talents. They're preoccupied with fantasies about success, power, brilliance, beauty, or the perfect mate. They believe they are superior and can only associate with equally special people. They monopolise conversations and belittle or look down on people they perceive as inferior. Now, there's a lot of out-group demonisation with the trans activists. Expect special favours and unquestioning compliance with their expectations. Now, obviously, this happens all the time with people misgendering people by accident, saying the wrong thing, blah, 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 blah. We've seen it all over social media, in articles, news articles, all around. We've all seen it. We all know exactly what that is. They take advantage of others to get what they want. Of course they do, and we've seen that too. Have an inability... just to go back one, actually. Take advantage of others to get what they want. Trans athletes, look out for that one. Have an inability or unwillingness to recognise the needs and feelings of others. Now, this one is universal in the trans activist groups, is that, the inability to recognise the needs and feelings of others. Women. Let's talk about how women are affected by trans people and trans females in particular. So they're envious of others and believe others envy them. They behave in an arrogant or haughty manner, coming across as conceited, boastful and pretentious. Vorsh. Insist on having the best of everything, for instance, the best car or office. At the same time, people with narcissistic personality disorder have trouble handling anything they perceive as criticism, and they can become impatient or angry when they don't receive special treatment, have significant interpersonal problems, and feel easily slighted. They react with rage or contempt and try to belittle the other person to make themselves appear superior. Vorsh again. Have difficulty regulating emotions and behaviour. Experience major problems dealing with stress and adapting to change. They feel depressed and moody because they fall short of perfection and have secret feelings of insecurity, shame, vulnerability and humiliation. So, to me, narcissistic personality disorder speaks far more to trans people than borderline does. And but I included it because borderline is often cited as the female version of narcissistic personality disorder, which I think is a little inaccurate, but I included it because it is part of the matrix of mental health that we're talking about here. So I've got a few studies here that relate narcissism, higher rates of narcissism, to the trans movement. So this paper presents, this one is done by a bunch of different people. Where was it? Sorry, I was trying to see where it was actually done, but I can't actually see where it was done. I don't know if it's American or whatever, but it was done in 1997. And what they found, so they paid special attention to pathological features in regulatory processes of the self system. Sorry, I just need to plug my iPad in because I just noticed it's starting to run out of charge. Sorry guys, I know this is very unprofessional. Excuse me. Okay, so this so specific attention was paid on pathological features in regulatory processes of the self system, as well as on personality factors associated with different types of gender disorders. Based on the results of retrospective analysis, a prospective study was designed to identify subtypes of gender dysphoric patients based on scrupulous psychiatric and psychopathological evaluation. Sorry, some of these words are just tongue twisters, aren't they? The evaluation procedure consists of clinical interview, structural interview, according to concepts of Kernenberg and blah, blah, blah. So let's get to the conclusion. The results are all there. Again, I'll post the links to all these so you can actually study them yourselves. But the conclusions are what we really want. So at this stage, the provisional status, at least for this video, at this stage, the provisional status of our data only permits some few conclusions. The central findings of this questionnaire analysis support the view of a great heterogeneity of gender disordered males, which not only extends to the already well-known gender and sexuality variables, but also to general personality pathology and especially different modes of self-regulation. We could identify a significant narcissistic pathology in most of our patients, but the regulation modes affected by this pathologically differ wildly. Now, one thing I would say is, so they matched this up to two other studies here from 1985 and 1993 that kind of corroborate what they're saying. But what I would also suggest, I haven't been able to look at those, by the way, and a lot of studies are actually locked behind a paywall, so you can't actually read a lot of these, which is quite annoying. And there isn't a lot of them, but the ones that exist, only some of them are available in this capacity. But one thing I will say is that that they did only have, how many was there? They didn't have that many people. I think it was like 30 people or something like that. It says it in here somewhere. I can't remember how many, but it wasn't very many people that they had a thing for. This, this kind of speaks to two different things, and that is that, the trans movement is quite small anyway. So it probably is quite hard to find a bunch of people that they can actually study anyway. So, it's one of them where, especially in 1997, I'm sure it was quite difficult to even get 30 people that they could get as transgender anyway. So this next one, we're going to read the abstract: Narcissism and Self-Esteem Among Homosexual and Heterosexual Male Students. So again, this one is not trans, but it does show that narcissism is quite high. Again, I couldn't read this one. Oh no, I could read this one. What am I talking about? I just had this for the abstract. So yeah, it does show that they sorry, I keep losing my place. So the hypothesis, which is based on the Freudian connection between narcissism and homosexuality, is supported by the results, indicating that the homosexual students score higher in both measures of narcissism and lower on the self-esteem measure. Now, they did use, now this is the actual study, which I will link, and the results do show that they are much higher, and they used the methodology was that they used the questionnaires that psychologists use. They used all of the ones that were available. So they used the classic one. Where is it? Methodology. Procedure. Where was it? Yeah. So they used the Kinsey thing about heterosexual, homosexual rating. They used the self-esteem scale. They used the narcissistic personality inventory, and they used the pathological narcissism inventory as well. So they used both of the best questionnaires that psychologists use to generate the results, and like they say, they scored much higher. And they say that the pattern appears with respect to vulnerable as well as grandiose narcissism. And the reason why I included this was because obviously many trans people are gay, and I was wondering if many of them are if many of them are attracted to the trans movement, or becoming trans, or at least just saying that they're trans because of this narcissism. And then, obviously they want a sense of achieving things, and what better way to achieve things than just attack everybody around them and make it some kind of activism. It's a very strange situation, and many different places are being held hostage by it. You've seen the Evergreen situation. I mean, a lot of campuses are being railroaded by this kind of behaviour, and I think it's very important to include these observations of personality disorders, mental health, and all the rest that are included in the homosexual sphere. And it's rarely spoken about on the left, and it's very disheartening. And to see this Jangles guy go up against I Hypocrite, and to basically he seems to not know or not acknowledge any of this stuff, even though he's a homosexual himself. And it's kind of strange, he kind of positions himself as though he knows a lot of the literature, and he knows all about trans issues and all the rest. He doesn't seem to have any grasp of what any of this could mean. These are all significant findings and significant known things about the homosexual community, and he doesn't think that any of this could ever factor in to anything negative that comes out of the homosexual experience. I mean, this doesn't even go into domestic issues or anything like that, because there are other issues that this points towards. It doesn't even point towards paedophilia or the sex thing that they were taught, the debate about sexual predatory actions. However, it is well known that narcissists are sexual predators. So it's and there are higher rates of psychopathy and narcissism in paedophiles. So it does beg the question, when that question came up in the debate of LP basically said, if I'd be worried that there's a narcissist basically in the toilet, there's a higher chance that the trans person could be narcissistic. And this other guy was like, no, that's not necessarily true. No, it is true. It is definitely true. The data backs it up. And this is a big question as to why people are trans, what are their motives, and what are they trying to get out of it. Now, I'm not saying all of them are trying to be paedophiles or sexual predators or assaulters. However, it speaks to a larger problem that if we don't address this behaviour, then these predators and these people get to move freely. Okay? They get to move freely under this guise because nobody's challenging it. Nobody's challenging anybody's motives here, and that they could be bad actors. And and I think that there are many bad actors in this group, and they are detrimental to the real trans people, the real people who just want to live their lives and get on with it and not have to have this horrible stigma attached to them. And the only reason this horrible stigma is attached to them is because of the narcissists in their group that are dragging everybody down. But everybody's cowed by them, including this Jangles guy. He's cowed by it. He's reined in. He's what is it, Richard Gannon? He's what they would call a flying monkey in the narcissistic sphere, who, you know, kind of fights for them and you know, kind of works for them in a way, as a kind of minion, because they're scared of them, or they benefit from them in some way, and they may even be narcissistic themselves. So it's a really tough situation, and I just wanted to make this response video just to show that there is literature out there that does back up LP's position and does back up the thought that he should be wary for his daughter's safety around extremely, especially the more flamboyant and strange trans people who struggle to pass. And I would say that the reason they struggle to pass is probably because they're lazy, and it's probably because they want to not put as much effort in, and that's probably because they're higher in narcissistic tendency. The trans people who pass are probably lower in narcissistic tendencies, and that's because they actually want to fulfill, and they're actually willing to go through the hard work that it takes to get there, okay? And they don't want to throw it in people's faces. They want to pass so they don't have to talk about it. The people who want to talk about it most are probably the ones who are higher in the narcissistic spectrum. So anyway, that's my point there. I hope that illuminates things for people. I hope it wasn't too boring. I wish I could have had some more interesting visuals for you, but there it is. But anyway, I'm probably going to upload a little bit more frequently than I have done. It's been like a year. I haven't really uploaded. I came back to my channel and noticed that there was I had some significant views on a couple of videos that I when I last left it didn't really have many views at all. So kind of surprised by that, but you know, it's kind of nice, you know. But anyway, thanks a lot for tuning in, and I'll see you guys again in the future.